Chapter 37 Mazen. Wake up, Prince. Aisha's voice was feather soft, and yet in the extreme silence of the tent it startled him awake. Mazen slowly sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes as his foggy mind pieced together where and when he was. The middle of the desert, many miles out from the Bedouin campsite they'd left 3 days ago on their way to the city of Giban. He glanced blearily around their tent, which was swathed in the golden shadows of dawn. Their belongings were untouched, their surroundings unchanged, but the silence, that was new. Aisha crouched down beside him, a severe dent between her brows. She raised a finger to her lips and mouthed a single word. Ghouls. Mazen rose shakily to his feet. He said nothing as Aisha whispered commands, instructing him to pack the tent and secure the supplies. The unnatural silence was so heavy it made every exhale too loud, every step a too sharp crunch. The quiet suffocated even the sigh of the wind. It was as if the world itself were holding its breath. Was this the work of the ghouls they had avoided days ago? It took a great effort to tamp down his fear as he and Aisha collapsed the tent and met the merchant and her bodyguard outside. They looked miserable, bundled in layers to fight off rigid morning cold. Lily had even donned her midnight merchant vestments atop her plain attire, though she still shuddered beneath them. Mazen sympathized. His brother's cloak felt inadequate. Luli and Kadir acknowledged them with terse nods, then mounted their horses in silence. It was a tacit rule that no one speak. Mazen had not realized how loud the desert was until it went completely silent. He had been unnerved the last time they skirted this eerie quiet, but this silence was worse, far worse. Gone was the whisper of the sand and the sigh of the breeze. He had never paid attention to the noise his horse's hooves made on the ground, but now he could not stop thinking about how loud every crunch was. Traveling through the desert was an already exhausting endeavor, but to do it while attempting to suffocate all sound made the journey doubly tiring. It suddenly seemed as if every motion was dangerous. The rustling of his equipment as he shifted on his saddle, the click of the stirrups every time he urged his horse in a different direction, and even the hiss of the sand as it gathered and slid off his clothing in undisturbed streams. Mazen rubbed his hands together in an effort to warm them and tried not to think about how parched his throat was and how he was too nervous to reach for the water skin tucked deep into his saddlebags. The others seemed to be existing in a similar state of uncertainty. They wore their misery plainly etched into their faces as frowns and slumped onto their shoulders like an invisible weight. Aisha may as well have been a statue, her gaze trained ahead, her fingers so stiff on the reins it hardly looked like she was gripping them at all. Hours went by. Mazen spent his time fretting and watching. Mostly he watched the merchant, who, when she wasn't observing her compass, watched him back. It was incredibly stress-inducing. With every look she shot in his direction, Mazen became more convinced she had somehow seen through his disguise. At some point, he combined paranoia and exhaustion became so great it blurred his sight, and the merchant became a vaguely hostile-looking smudge amidst the hills of rose-gold sand. He turned away from her, perturbed. Mazen overthought every motion and look and noise until miraculously sound returned to the world. The sun had dipped below the horizon by then, and shadows carved the ripples in the sand into sculpted waves. A distant hawk broke the silence, and then the wind whistled past them and threw sand in their faces. Kadir let out a long, deep sigh. Aisha groaned. The dangers passed. Her voice was hoarse with disuse. Mazen snapped into action, immediately reaching into his saddlebag for their water skin. The liquid was tasteless, and yet it seemed the sweetest thing he'd ever had in his life. He had to force himself to take sips and to hand the water skin over to Aisha afterwards. Lily glanced warily over her shoulder. You think those are the same ghouls we evaded before? Kadir frowned. Most likely, though their tenacity is unusual. The merchant groaned. Is it too much to ask for 1 day of uneventful travel? She flexed her fingers in Kadir's direction. He handed her their water skin. Mazen didn't realize he was staring at her until she lowered the water skin and frowned at him. Something on my face? His thoughts were so formless and scattered that he was at a loss for how to respond. He was just so glad to see that her visage had resolved into a definitive shape again. Thankfully, Aisha filled the awkward silence. "It's a good thing ghouls are slow," she said. "Otherwise, from the sound, we'd have to deal with an army." Mazen tucked that information away. He had gathered that ghouls deadened noise where they wandered, but it was helpful to know one could estimate the size of a group by the quiet it provoked. Useful and extremely disquieting. Lily scowled. "They probably smell the death on the two of you." Aisha snorted. "Don't act so virtuous, relic seller. If they're tracking any of us, it's you. You have the bag of relics. You're practically walking ghoul bait." A memory snapped into place at her words. Mazen remembered the story his mother had once told him about the ghouls. One could still recall the beginning of. In the desert there exists a group of undead jinn who have one foot in death and another in life. What they lack in strength they make up for with their sharpened senses. Though they are mostly blind, they can smell magic from miles and miles away. There was a lull in the narrative as he tried to remember the rest. "Saidi," Aisha's voice was a hiss. Mazen looked up and saw the merchant staring at him. She looked perplexed. "Oh." It dawned on him he'd said the words aloud. "Sorry, I was remembering a story." The merchant looked at him intently, eyes narrowed as if she were trying to read him. Mazen's heart hitched. No, it was as if she were looking through him. He saw a flash out of the corner of his eye, a hiss of wind in his ear, a thud as something pierced the dirt. Mazen followed the group's startled gazes to an arrow shaft protruding from the sand. He pressed a hand to his cheek, but there was no cut, no blood, just a phantom pain chased by a current of fear. Then, pandemonium. Another arrow shot past them, one, two, a volley of them, coming through a curtain of dirt. One whizzed past the merchant's shoulder, another grazed Mazen's horse. It rose with a terrified whinny, and Mazen gasped as he dug his heels into its flanks. He was able to remain in the saddle only by holding tight to the reins. He calmed his horse enough to steady his vision and look beyond the wall of dust. His heart stopped when he saw their assailants, an army of shambling white forms garbed in black, with sunken eye sockets shadowed beneath their hoods. If not for their unnaturally long, wiry limbs and empty eyes, they could have passed as human. Mazen was torn between wanting to scream and wanting to cry. "Where did they come from?" The merchant's voice was barely a whisper. Her bodyguard reached out, set his fingers on her wrist. "Luli," he said softly, "there are too many. We have to outrun them." The merchant glanced down at her compass. Even Mazen could tell that it was useless, for the arrow was spinning in wild circles. Luli shoved it into her pocket with a shaky sigh, and they fled. But there was no escaping the ghouls. The air filled with wails and shrieks as the undead creatures fired on them from various directions. Mazen swerved in his saddle to avoid one arrow, only to have another tear a hole through his pant leg. He couldn't help the sound of distress that escaped his lips as he flattened himself against his horse. It took all his concentration to maneuver around the creatures stumbling into his way. Luli made no such effort. Out of the corner of his eye he saw her ride right over a ghoul without batting an eye, but the creature retaliated before it fell, sweeping its sword through the air, ripping the bottom of her cloak. Luli cried out, and the sound caught the attention of her bodyguard. Kadir glanced over his shoulder, eyes wide with alarm. He relaxed only when Luli waved a hand to reassure him of her safety. But his eyes, there was something strange about them. They were eerily bright and flickering? No, they were sparking like fire. Kadir's gaze cut sharply to him. The bodyguard blinked, and just as abruptly as the strange fire had appeared, it disappeared. He turned away without comment. Mazen stared at his back, troubled. He wondered if he was losing his mind, but he did not linger on the strangeness of the sight for long. He couldn't, not with the hordes of black-clad undead closing in on them. The pack had grown denser, the creatures' bodies packed so tightly together they looked like a moving storm cloud. Mazen's heart sank into his stomach when he realized they were surrounded. "Ambush!" Aisha yelled at the same time. Mazen thought, "How will we survive this?" The thief clenched her hands into fists over her reins. "They're too well organized for a normal horde." She spoke loudly over the chaos. "Someone has to be controlling them." Where? The merchant's voice cracked as she dodged an arrow. Where's this mastermind you speak of? Because if we can't find them, we're as good as dead. We're... Luli. Kadir's voice was barely audible, but the resignation in it made Mazen wince. He watched as Kadir raised an arm. The bodyguard tapped his wrist, a slight motion that made his skin shimmer oddly beneath the sun. The merchant stiffened in her saddle. No. Her response was so immediate, the terror on her face so palpable, that it made the last of Mazen's nerves fray. What? He glanced between them frantically. What's happening? But the bodyguard just looked past him to Luli. Trust me, he said softly. Some silent message seemed to pass between them. Eventually, reluctantly, Luli nodded. We keep riding to the center of the mob then, Kadir said. Aisha stared at him. Do you want to die? When neither Luli nor Kadir responded, Aisha turned to Mazen. There was a desperation in her eyes he had never seen before. He knew she was waiting for him to object, but he had no power here. He never had. We're out of ideas. His throat was tight, and he could barely manage his next words. Whatever this plan is, it's better than nothing. It's not a plan, Aisha snapped, but her voice lacked its usual heat. There was despair in every taut line of her body. It's suicide. Mazen opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have the heart to offer reassurances, not when he didn't believe in them himself. Aisha snapped her reins, pushing her horse harder, faster. Stay behind me, she called back. If your gods are kind, maybe they'll spare us. She turned away and shot after Luli and Kadir, toward the center of the turmoil. Mazen muttered a prayer beneath his breath and chased after her.